Hi, I'm New York Times Metro reporter Jeff Mays sitting in for Sam Roberts. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, I'll speak with political journalist Ross Barkan. Ross thinks progressives within the Democratic Party have a leadership problem, and he compares the 1968 campaign to today. But first, I'm joined now by fellow New York Times Metro desk reporter Dana Rubinstein. This week, the mayor introduced a new use for the city's drone technology. We'll discuss that and the latest activity of the mayor. Also, how have local politics been shifting since congestion pricing was suspended? Welcome, Dana.
Thanks for having me.
So Mayor Adams has branded himself as a sort of tech mayor, right? He loves drones. Like, how many uses has he found for drone technology?
So many. I spend a lot of time in Rockaway Beach. Those drones are constantly over the beach and over the water. You can hear them. They're like very loud bees. He uses them to sort of police parades and protests. And now he's proposing using them in Central Park to deal with a spike in crime there.
And there was also new technology with drones to warn people for flooding, right?
Oh, God, I forgot about that. Yes, he also rolled them out, I guess it was last week, to go into flood-prone areas of New York City before there was a big storm that might inundate, portions of the city, and warn people who live in basements to be aware and to pay attention and to move to higher ground if necessary.
Why do you think the mayor is so into drone technology? Do you have any indication?
I mean, he is really he's a self-described tech geek. He's really, really into sort of novel new technologies, right? Big into crypto. He had that subway robot that was patrolling the Times Square mezzanines. He really likes the robo-dogs. Shot spotter. He's just one of those guys who really likes gadgets.
And on top of that, they've introduced new technology in the subway, right, to potentially scan for people who are carrying guns. Is there any sense of measuring how successful these projects would or have been, or?
I mean, it's a bit soon to say. We know that they have retired the subway robot because it was apparently ineffective, and they said they would find a new use for it at the time, but that might have been a face-saving measure. I'm not sure. They haven't announced any new uses for it. The drones that are supposed to hover over the ocean waters and drop flotation devices to swimmers in distress, I'm not sure they've done any dropping of flotation devices yet. That's something of an open question. But they are sending back a lot of interesting video from the beach about, documenting human lifeguards doing rescues, which, I guess at least serve a PR exercise.
And my last question on this is that there have been some questions raised about civil liberties in terms of the use of these drones and the footage and the video, the noise, sound that they record. Has that been resolved in any sort of way?
It hasn't, and it is a real concern for civil libertarians because we all know we are always on camera, basically. But this sort of heightens that dynamic. I was talking to a surfer who was out on his board waiting for a wave, and there was a drone hovering over him. People surf to be sort of at one with nature, and not only did it feel invasive to him, but it's sort of at odds with the whole idea of being in nature. And I think the same dynamic is at play in Central Park. We'll see how parkgoers feel about having drones buzzing overhead.
I want to move on to talk a little bit about congestion pricing. Governor Hochul pulled it back. The mayor, has he been a strong supporter of that decision on congestion pricing? He
has said that he thinks that was the right move. He's always, in the past couple of years, been equivocal about congestion pricing, and so yeah, he thinks that was the right idea, and he sort of speaks vaguely about changes that need to be made to the program. So yeah, he seems supportive of it, yeah.
Has the city seen any sort of effects from this decision, or has the mayor seen any political effects from this decision to cancel congestion pricing?
Well, it's really Governor Hochul who suffered the political backlash because it really was her decision alone. And so there's been a really huge outcry from sort of the governing elite and civic society. Congestion pricing polls quite poorly among regular New Yorkers. But people also like to note that before congestion pricing has been implemented in cities around the world, there's always what they call like the political valley of death, where it polls quite poorly right before it's introduced, and then once it's introduced, people look around and they see slightly emptier streets and easier, bus commutes, and they sort of reappraise the whole thing.
And there was a suggestion that the governor pulled back congestion pricing because of the upcoming elections. Is there any sense that Mayor Adams has any sort of political liability around that issue? He has a primary next June, a competitive primary.
I don't think so. I mean, I think, the polls show that New Yorkers aren't crazy about the idea. I mean, it is a new fee. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any new fee have a lot of political support. But no, I think in some ways it's kind of the easy way out.
The mayor has also been having strong conversations with the city council recently. There have been some proposals to revise the charter. Tell us what did the mayor propose and what are the effects of those changes?
The mayor's proposal basically adds like another 30 days to the review process for any city council legislation dealing with public safety. And originally his proposal added like 90 days, but there was a huge outcry and it was reduced to 30. And it will be on the city it will be on the city ballot in November. And by virtue of his making that proposal, because of the arcane rules surrounding these sorts of things, it pushes off a city council proposal that would have required city council approval for like 20 mayoral commissionerships. So, it has really heightened tensions with the city council. They're clearly at odds. The mayor likes to say that everything is totally hunky-dory with the council, but the facts really seem to indicate otherwise.
I saw that Speaker Adrian Adams called the mayor's commission unserious, and you referenced a potential reason for the commission. I'm wondering what is going to happen with that council legislation around approval of certain positions?
We don't quite know. I mean, the city council's proposal has passed the council, and it will have another opportunity to be on a ballot. The mayor could continue to create other charter revision commissions that keep pushing off the council proposal from the ballot. It's hard to see that dynamic going on and on and on and on without some sort of legal challenge from the city council. So it really remains to be seen.
There's been pushback from the city council. I know I've heard from people who feel like the mayor is sort of encroaching on their legislative powers with some of these proposals.
Well, right, because there is an open question among a lot of people as to why it is that public safety legislation should require more time than other forms of legislation. I mean, already these sort of legislative proposals take, months, if not years, to enact because they are always controversial. And people have asked, what is it about public safety legislation versus legislation about any manner of other things that renders it so much more important that it requires more review?
And the mayor is a former police captain. He ran on a law and order platform. That's really what helped get him elected. Could that be a potential reason and in line with the upcoming primary next June? Sure.
I mean, he law and order is his brand, or certainly wants it to be his brand. And there was that recent bill that the council passed, the How Many Stops Act, which requires police officers to document more lower-level stops. That the mayor, really tried to avoid. It was vetoed. The veto was overruled, if my memory serves. He ran like a really massive PR campaign against it. He really believes that public safety is the prerequisite to prosperity, and he, as a former police captain, understands public safety better than civilians, and he should have the authority to manage public safety, as he wants to.
And how is the city doing on crime? I know the numbers are down, but still higher than before the pandemic. Could that affect how he's judged on his handling of crime next year?
For sure. I mean, he also often talks about the distinction between the statistics and public perception. And I also think a lot of things that people perceive as crime or disorder are not captured in statistics. I mean, my desk at the Times is next to the window, and it seems like every time I look out, someone's either urinating on the street or having some sort of mental health episode. So there is a pretty pervasive sense that things feel a little more disorderly than they used to.
And so the mayor is going to face a competitive primary next year. We already have 3 serious challengers who've come out. Crime is going to be an issue. What else is going to be an issue in next year's election?
Well, I think, the stumbles surrounding rolling out 3K will be an issue, housing affordability, childcare affordability, his cuts to library services. And I wonder if people will be able to make public disorder an issue. I wonder if they'll be able to sort of, target that core of his political persona because, crime has been trending downward in line with national trends. But there are still some vulnerable spots there.
And finally, next year's election will be the first time in over 100 years that the New York Times editorial board does not make an endorsement in the New York City's mayor's race. I'm wondering what you make of that. What has been the response to that decision?
I think the response among the New York City political folks is one of outrage, because there is a feeling that this doesn't cost anything for the Times, and it is an important public service for the people of New York City, which is home to the New York Times and birthed in the New York Times. So people are really upset.
Does the Times editorial make a difference?
Yes, it does in mayoral elections. Many people credit the Times' endorsement of Catherine Garcia in 2021 as like a really key factor in elevating her to almost winning the mayoralty. And many people are also interpreting the decision as just an outright, if inadvertent, gift to Eric Adams.
And do you agree with that? Do you think?
I have no opinion.
Finally, the election is coming up. Brad Lander recently, the city controller, recently announced his candidacy. I'm wondering what you think that effect will have on the race. He's certainly a citywide elected official, handles the city's finances. What do you think the long-term effect of his endorsement or jumping into the race will be?
I mean, it's hard to say. He does wield audit authority over the city, and the Adams administration has already been complaining about sort of the optics of someone challenging the mayor politically while also being able to audit the mayor's office and his administration. I mean, he's one of 3 all but declared candidates so far who all bear some resemblance to each other politically, and there's more to come. So I think it remains to be seen. Do these folks form some sort of anyone but Eric slate? With ranked choice voting, everything is kind of complicated.
Finally, Mr. Adams has been, his campaign has been the subject of federal investigation. Is there any updates into the status of that investigation? I
mean, the investigation does appear ongoing. It is getting pretty close to the re-election cycle. So, I think the Adams campaign is, very worried about the encroachment of the investigation onto the re-election cycle and what impact it will have. And the Justice Department does have a policy of trying not to, conduct these investigations in the midst of elections. So, it's still ongoing.
Thanks, Dana, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, do progressive Democrats have a leadership problem? Writing in the New York Times Magazine this week, essayist Ross Barkan believes the Democratic Party has a leadership problem and it's hurting progressives. Ross ran as a progressive for the New York State Senate in 2018 and frequently writes about the challenges facing the Democratic Party. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be back.
Yeah, this is great. I wonder, your essay was about the leaderless left. And I'm wondering, maybe you can define that. What does that mean, the leaderless left?
Yeah, so it was this trend that I was looking at for some time and really trying to pin down. And what I found was, particularly on the progressive and activist left over time, especially over the last few years, there was an exhaustion with personalities and leaders after the 2010s, where you really saw, a great interest in individuals, whether it was AOC, whether it was Bernie Sanders, whether it was online influencers or certain famed activists. I think we're entering an interesting era, especially with the pro-Palestinian protests, where there are no defined household names leading these protests and these movements. And even as I went back and looked at a lot of the major activist leaders of the 2010s, DeRay McKesson, Black Lives Matter, Linda Sarsour, the Women's March, Tamika Mallory, they didn't necessarily have staying power. And I was comparing that to the 1960s and 70s, where there was an enormous array of household names leading movements, whether it's the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, SDS, Students for Democratic Society. You can go down the list and really find distinct personalities. And the 2010s had that, I think, with politicians, and we still have those. There's still certainly Bernie Sanders is still in the Senate, AOC is still in Congress, but something I found, looking at sort of activist activity, talking to activists themselves, especially on the younger side, and especially with the pro-Palestinian protests, anti-Israel protests, there's not that same hunger for defined leadership, for that, famed figure. So I found it very interesting, and I wrote a piece about that.
This is not something that just happened to the left, right? This seems like a deliberate decision not to have leaders.
It's a little bit of both. I think there's an outgrowth. I traced it back to Occupy Wall Street, which was quite influential, though it didn't last as a movement. Its ideas certainly lived on in the Sanders campaign, and even in Bill de Blasio in New York. But also there's this ethos of sort of horizontal style organizing and this sort of skepticism of having strong, defined leaders. And that was a criticism of Occupy, and understandably so. And I wrote about an incident where John Lewis, the famed congressman, civil rights icon, came to speak to an Occupy encampment in 2011, and there was some controversy about whether he was turned away. And what was interesting about that, going way back when, was that, it wasn't that they were necessarily telling him to leave. It was more like, well, he wasn't on the agenda, so we have to follow the agenda, and no one is above anyone else. So even John Lewis could not just pop right into a speaking slot. So I think this was evolving over time, and also I think in particular with the pro-Palestinian protests, there is a fear of being doxxed. There's a fear of being harassed. That's why you see protesters in masks. And certainly a lot of the political establishment on the right and even on the left is very pro-Israel. So I think for a lot of the most sort of passionate activists and advocates for the Palestinian cause, even anti-Zionists, they are very wary and even afraid of stepping out into the spotlight because there are certainly forces arrayed against them.
I wonder if you think the political cause that the left is advocating for is hurt by not having sort of defined leaders as in the past.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's one I grappled with in my piece. I spoke to some professors and people involved in the long-range movements of the left, dating back to the 70s and 80s. And I think, one told me he was arguing it does hurt in the sense that leaders could give shorthand for ideas. You could say, going back to Eugene Debs, the great leader of the Socialist Party, I'm Eugene Debs socialist, or Michael Harrington founds the DSA, I'm a Michael Harrington, leftist or socialist. Having people can help define ideas in the public's eye. It can also discipline messaging more. That there's a lot of debate now in the Palestinian movement, among pro and anti alike. What does from the river to the sea mean? Certain supporters of Israel think it's calling for the extermination of Israel. It's anti-Semitic. Many on sort of the pro-Palestine left say, well, no, it's a call for Palestinian liberation. And people mean different things by it. And I think that's fine. What was interesting to me is there's no person or group of people who can educate that, who can go, speak to the media or even, give some sort of put some video online and really, try to hash out, okay, here's what this means to people. It's very much contested. And so when you don't have those defined leaders, it can be harder to sometimes define message and discipline as well.
I know with the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, there was a sense that when Martin Luther King was assassinated, when Malcolm X was assassinated, the movement sort of died down with them. Also, you could attack certain leaders on certain positions as well. So it seems like the idea of not focusing so much on the leader would be a way of sort of inoculating the movement from those criticisms. Why has it worked out that way at all?
So I think that would be the argument from a lot of young activists, that there's a feeling that going back to the movements of the 1960s, you had the FBI and CIA going after the leaders of the civil rights movement. You had some who were more controversial than others, who had personal failings, and these personal failings could be weaponized. You had with the Women's March, for example, the leaders were implicated in scandal, and that sapped momentum. So I think it is an interesting pro and con, where definitely movements can be, if they have amorphous leadership or undefined leadership, they are less vulnerable to that. They're less vulnerable to putting all their eggs in the basket of a few people. So that is a strength, but again, also could be a weakness too if you don't have individuals to carry it forward. And I talk about that with Bernie Sanders a bit. I'm very interested to see, is there a true successor for him? Still unclear, still being contested. And of course, he's still in office as well.
How do you think this dynamic is going to play out at the upcoming convention?
Yeah.
You made some comparisons to 1968.
Yeah.
Are we going to see what we saw in 1968? It certainly feels like the environment is similar.
Yeah. Definitely similarities and differences. I would say the tensions of 68 were a lot higher, and the divisions in the party were much deeper. Kamala Harris really has the Democratic establishment and even the progressive establishment aligned around her in a way Hubert Humphrey did not. At the same time, there are going to be protests. Pro-Palestinian protesters have been planning for many months to march outside the convention. They have delegates inside the convention, not many relative to the 1960s, not many even relative to 2016 when Bernie Sanders brought over, I think over 1,000 or 2,000 delegates, I forget the number, a very large number into the convention hall. You don't have that. And I think for now the party is fairly unified, and there's sort of this new buoyancy around Harris as she takes on Trump. But those tensions are there, and they're not going to go away. And certainly since the conflict, in Israel and Gaza is so intractable, I mean, tragically, there are going to be probably more flashpoints and more ways for, activists to feel aggrieved and to protest.
I was at a Kamala Harris rally in Harlem last night, and there were protesters who were escorted out. Mayor Eric Adams led a chant of "Remember to Vote," and people cheered as the activists were escorted outside. Do you think there's any sense that the progressive movement will get any of their agenda items addressed at the convention? So
I think there's some possibility of olive branches around Israel and Gaza, in part because Tim Walz's presence on the ticket coming from Minnesota, that there's a big uncommitted vote out of there. Harris herself is somewhat undefined on the issue. Biden himself had decades of experience and ties to the Israeli government and felt very passionately, certainly about Zionism. Harris is certainly a Zionist and certainly someone who's very supportive of Israel, but she is younger and she doesn't have that same history with foreign policy. So that does provide an opening. How big an opening, we don't know, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens at the convention. And then if they win, right, how do they approach the Middle East versus how the Biden and even Obama administrations approach the Middle East? You
brought up Tim Walz. He's been aligned more with the sort of progressive side of the party. I'm wondering, what factors do you think led to his being chosen by Kamala Harris?
Walz really shot up from nowhere in terms of when Biden steps aside on July 21st, and immediately there's a short list thrown out of who her VPs could be, and Walz was not one of them. So it was fascinating to see his very rapid rise to the top of the heap. I think his cable TV appearances played a big role. I think the fact that he could very comfortably and aggressively argue for the Democratic agenda for Harris helped him. Certainly his record in Minnesota is one of progressive liberal policy accomplishments. So that probably appealed to a degree to Harris in terms of uniting the party. Being from Minnesota, also being a congressman from a tough swing district. I think whoever Harris was going to pick needed to be someone who was battle tested like that, because she herself has a thin and somewhat weak electoral track record. So that's why Josh Shapiro was in the running, and Mark Kelly. They've won tough races in swing states. Walz is not in a swing state, but he held down a congressional seat through 2 red waves. So he has a certain instinct for reaching across the aisle, for massaging his views. And he used to be more conservative, and he's moved to the left. So I think take it all together. And the fact that the Democratic base just seems excited about him in a way, I'm not sure Mark Kelly would have excited in the same way. Maybe Shapiro would have. But as of now, today, the Walz pick looks very good. We'll see if she actually wins. But I would say, sitting here in August, it seems like a strong pick.
I'm wondering if his choice will have any impact on the sort of electoral college strategy. A lot of people advocated for someone like Shapiro in an important swing state like Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I think that was the downside of Walz, and why a lot of analytical and statistician types pushing for Shapiro, because Pennsylvania really is that hinge state. It really is that tipping point state. If Harris does not win it, if Trump does, Trump is probably going to be president. So I think the argument for Shapiro rested on that. And that's a real argument. Walz has no ties to Pennsylvania. Being a Minnesota governor doesn't mean much east. I don't think people care. But I think the feeling probably in the Harris camp was, listen, this guy can go in there, and he's a gun owner, and he's a military veteran, and he is folksy, and he is charismatic, and he can go in there and make a case, and she can make a case too. So they did give up, when they didn't pick Shapiro, they did give up that really built-in Pennsylvania advantage, but they probably figure Harris and Walz can rally the base, and Trump is unpopular, and Pennsylvania is still very much in play for them. But yeah, it's an interesting debate, and there definitely are good arguments for Shapiro.
Sure, you're going to be watching some of this as it plays out at the debate next week. Ross, thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's it for this week's show. Thank you for watching. I'm Jeff Mays, filling in for Sam Roberts. Join us again next week on CUNY TV.